Okay, so let's get started. I'm in the darkroom view of Darktable here with an image of Buachaille Etive Mòr in Glen in Scotland, which is, I'm sure, familiar to many landscape photographers, certainly here in the UK. And on the right here we have the module stack in Darktable. So Darktable works by piping the image data from the raw file through all these modules and out to the final output image. In this view here, on this tab with a little kind of power icon, we're seeing all the currently active modules. We can cycle through all modules and active modules. And the modules with grey circles here are essentially always on because they're necessary to produce an output image. And then we also have some kind of optional modules here that we can turn off and on as we like to affect how the image looks. And we're going to be adding more of these modules as we go through to produce our final image. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is just some basic kind of fundamental adjustments to the base image before we get going on our more kind of artistic choices, if you like. I use a Fujifilm camera, which has a slightly different sensor technology to most other manufacturers. It has an X-trans sensor as opposed to a Bayer sensor. Darktable does, in my opinion, a much better job of demosaicing X-trans files than, for example, Lightroom does. So it uses a different kind of algorithm, a different method for demosaicing those files. And I like to just improve that a little bit more. If you have a Bayer sensor camera, which is most manufacturers, Nikon, Canon, Sony, etc., you don't really need to do this, but if you happen to have a Fuji camera, I'd suggest making these changes here. Change it to Markstein 3-pass method and with twice the color smoothing. And that will just improve your results a little bit. I'm going to close that down. And the next thing I want to do is a little bit of lens correction. So if I zoom in on this tree, we can see we have a little bit of chromatic aberration, a little bit of green and red fringing. So I'm going to deal with that by adding the lens correction module. So I'm going to go up to the little search bar here above the module stack and just type lens, and there's our lens correction module. So I can turn this on just by clicking the power icon, open it up. And most cameras and lenses are found in the database. In fact, Fuji camera files have their metadata for this kind of thing embedded, so it'll just find it in the file. But we can see if I turn the module off and on, we can see that we're losing a little bit of distortion there. If I zoom in on my tree, we can see that we've also got rid of most of the chromatic aberration, certainly not enough to be noticeable at kind of normal viewing sizes. So I'm happy with that. So we'll get rid of our search so we can go back to our normal modules again. I'm going to add a little bit of basic denoising in the same way, so I'm just going to type denoise, and I'm going to use profile denoise. So this is kind of a profiled set of denoising settings for each lens and camera in any given range that Darktable will find and just apply. That just takes off the worst of any noise. I'm at the base ISO of the camera here, 200 ISO, so it's not too noisy, but it always helps just to nudge a little bit of noise off the image when we can. Okay, now some basic exposure and white balance adjustments. The image is a little dark at the moment, so I'm going to go into our exposure module here, which is already added automatically by Darktable, and I'm just going to increase it maybe a stop. Obviously, I'm always looking to avoid blowing out any highlights in the sky, and especially in this waterfall. I'm keeping an eye on the histogram, which is changing at the top. And that's about right. Okay, close that module down. And now I'm going to adjust the white balance. Now there is a white balance module here. This is kind of a base white balance that Darktable sets, taking its reference from the camera. Generally, you don't want to touch this one. Instead, go higher up the stack to where it says color calibration. I'm going to click the cat tab in here. This looks extremely complicated, but basically if we click this eyedropper, that's the equivalent of kind of an auto white balance setting in other software like Lightroom. Generally, it does a pretty good job. This square that's been drawn on the image is the area that the software is taking into account when it's assessing the white balance. You may be familiar with kind of choosing a neutral point, like a grey or a white. So if we draw a new box around a similar kind of colour in the image, you can see that it's actually pretty good in its auto setting. So that's fine. Now I'm going to leave it as it is. It looks fine to me. It was somewhat cool to begin with. If I turn the module off and then back on again, now it's warmed up quite a lot. So I'm again happy with that setting. Next thing I want to do is go into our tone mapper. So this is how tones are mapped from the raw data to essentially the screen. And there are two tone mappers in Darktable. There is Filmic RGB, which has been around for some years, and Sigmoid, which is slightly newer. I'm going to close down these extra options here just to avoid any confusion. We can adjust our kind of base image contrast here. I'm just going to slide this up a little bit to give us slightly more dynamic range. You can see that we're starting to go a little bit close to the edge of the histogram here in terms of shadows, but we still have some room in the highlights. So I'm going to use this skew slider here just to nudge the whole thing up a little bit. Okay, so now we've got the maximum dynamic range out of our image. For now, we can always go back and adjust this. And I may just raise the black point. The black's looking a little bit dark. I'm going to raise this black point just a touch. I don't want to crush the blacks too much, but there we go. Okay, so that's our basic exposure and contrast adjustment done. Now we can look at adding some contrast to the image. There are probably 5 or 6 different ways of doing that in Darktable, but my favourite is to use the module called RGB, Color Balance RGB. So I'm going to activate this module, open it up. And again, it looks kind of more complicated than you might be used to with Lightroom, but it's reasonably straightforward. I'm going to first bump the global vibrance, so the general vibrance of the image up, just a touch. I'm reasonably happy with the contrast as it is. I'm not going to adjust the global contrast here. And then we can change the saturation grading per tone, so we can change the saturation in the shadows, the midtones, the highlights. Generally speaking, in the real world, we perceive more saturation in the shadows and the midtones than we do the highlights. So I like to have a kind of a staggered setting like this. So that's maybe a little bit overcooked in the shadows, bring that back a touch. Less is always more. Okay, and then we can change what's called the perceptual brilliance grading. That's the kind of the brightness, if you like, of the various different tones in the image. So we can boost the shadows way up, or we can bring them way down. I'm going to drop the shadows a tiny bit and boost the highlights, hopefully without doing too much clipping. If we click this icon here, we can turn on the clipping indicators. Red is for shadows, blue is for blown highlights. So we're not blowing any highlights just yet, that's good. I don't mind a little bit of shadow clipping. Shadows are kind of natural. It just means there's no light, that's fine. Okay, turn that back off. And that's our Color Balance RGB module more or less done with. One of Darktable's strengths is its masking, something that Lightroom is only kind of just catching up with, really. So I've added global contrast here with Color Balance RGB, but what I'd like to do is further boost contrast just in this waterfall area, just to bring out those streaks, if you like. And we can do that with Darktable's masking tools. So I'm going to use Color Balance RGB again, but in order to do that, I need to duplicate this one or make a new instance. If I click this little icon here, if I right click that, we can see that we now have 2 instances of Color Balance RGB. This is reset to the defaults again, so we're not applying the same one twice. Just to keep things organized, I like to rename my duplicate modules. So if you hold Control, click on the module, and I'm going to call this Waterfall Contrast. So I know which is which. I know this is my global one, this is my waterfall contrast one. So before I make any actual adjustment settings, I'm going to make a mask. The mask options are available in pretty much every module. We have essentially a mask that covers the whole image, a drawn mask where we draw shapes to define where the mask hits, a parametric mask where we define a mask with image parameters such as brightness or colour, or a combination of drawn and parametric, which is probably the most powerful of them all, and then raster we'll come to a bit later on. So I'm going to add a drawn and parametric mask here, and I'm going to start with a parametric mask. So I'm going to start with some parameter of the image that will isolate this part of the waterfall so that I can just adjust that part without adjusting the rest. And different modules have different parameters they can affect, and we can see the effect of these masks by hovering over the slider here and pressing the C key. So we're looking for areas of very stark difference between the area we're interested in and the rest of the image. So this is the grey value, essentially the brightness values of the image, and that's not bad. We have the red channel, again not too bad, green, blue, and then we have the JZ channel, if you like. A lot of difference there. You can see that the waterfall is very stark white. The CZ, the chroma, so the saturation, if you like, which is fairly global across the image. We can see that the kind of the brown heather here is a little bit more saturated than the grey rocks, the waterfall, but not standing out that much. And then the hue channel, so the different colours in the image. Again, not too bad. There is some isolation, but not a great deal. I think our best bet is probably here in the JZ. So let's grab this little range dropper here, and that will allow us to select a range of values. And then if we click this icon up here, the blend mask, we can see where the mask is being applied. So at the moment it's being applied to everywhere that's yellow. If I change this, we can see that we're getting more and more tones in the image. That's probably kind of, we're starting to lose a little bit of specificity there. So let's bring that back in. And I'm going to feather this. So feathering will kind of smooth the transition between the areas. Also blurring the radius as well. Feather a little bit more, I think. And I might just adjust things so that darker tones come in. I'm not worried too much about the rest of the image at the moment because we're going to do something in a minute that will limit our parametric mask just to an area that we define further. So I'm dragging this bottom slider here, which kind of is the range of selection between these two sliders here. So we're selecting everything from this darker tone up into middle grey. So that's a fairly good selection. We've got most of that waterfall selected without selecting too much of anything else around it. So we're still selecting a lot of the sky. We don't particularly want to affect the sky necessarily in the same way that we're affecting the waterfall. So now I'm going to add the drawn part of the mask. So here's our parametric mask, here's our drawn mask controls. And I'm going to use the path tool, and that will allow me to click and draw a path, shape, or a regular shape around the area that we want to mask off. Around here, getting that little bit of foam, go around these rocks, and then to complete our path we right click and make sure that your combined masks drop down here is set to exclusive. If we set it to say inclusive, for example, then it just adds more to the original mask. We don't want that. We want to say use the parametric mask only inside this path that I've drawn. So we set this to exclusive and make that happen. Now we can edit the mask as much as we like after the event. So I can drag this bit in. And then this outer dotted line here is kind of the feathering. So if you drag that in, you'll reduce the feathering amount. So we can see here the mask is kind of intruding into the landscape in the background, which I don't want. I want to limit it much more just to the waterfall area. I'll maybe drag this in past these rocks. I still want this. And I'm going to drag in my feathering around this big rock here. Okay. So you can see how fine the control that Darktable gives you with these masks. You can really limit things just to where you want to, which is often the key. It's rare that you want to apply an adjustment to the whole image, especially when it comes to very kind of powerful global changes like contrast. You really want to limit them just where you want to apply them. Okay, so I'm going to turn off my mask now, and then we can look at making the actual adjustments to this area that we've masked off. Okay, so before we go up to the settings, I'm just going to click this Show and Edit Mask Elements button to remove that distracting line from where we drew our mask. And we'll go back up to our colour balance RGB settings. And I'm mainly interested in this brilliance grading again. I want to drop the shadows down, drop the midtones down too much, and give the whites a bit more of a boost. Again, clicking on the clipping indicator here, making sure that we're not going overboard. It's quite easy to overdo these streaks in waterfalls, especially long exposure waterfalls like this. This is 1 by 2.6, so quite a long exposure. I don't think I used a filter for this one. It was just dark enough that morning to get away with it using base ISO and a smaller aperture. So let's just turn this off and on, off and on. Okay. The shadows up a tiny bit. So you can see we've just got a bit more punch. It's gone from being kind of a uniform grey to something with a bit more about it. So that's our localized waterfall contrast adjustment. And of course we can always come back to this at a later time if we want to tweak it a bit further based on what we do to the image afterwards. Okay, so now what I want to do is add some drama, some punch to the sky. It's looking a bit flat and grey. Scotland in November will do that for you. So let's go to our colour calibration module again, and we're going to right click to create a new instance. So now we have two. And again, keeping things organised, we're going to call this Sky Drama. And now we know which one's which. This is our global one, this one is our specific one. And I'm going to add a drawn parametric mask again. I'm in my grey channel here of the colour calibration module. I'm going to grab the red and increase it by 100% to 1. And then I'm going to change the blend mode of the mask from normal to multiply. Now you can see we have indeed added some drama to the sky, but we've also added way too much drama to the rest of the image. So this is where our good old masking tools come into play. So the first thing I'm going to use is a drawn mask in this case. So I'm going to use a gradient, and I want the effect to start about here. Okay, that's great. So we can see that the gradient is affecting this part of the image. So you can see how we can fade it out. If you want to change the feathering, you can hold Shift, roll your mouse wheel. I want it to be fairly crisp. Maybe I will just drag it a little bit because we're getting more of the grounding than I'd like. And what you can also do, which is quite nice in Darktable, is if you've got kind of a slightly irregular, obviously you can change the angle. You can also give it a slight curve by rolling your mouse wheel with no key. So let's do that because we are using a wide angle lens, 11mm on an APS-C camera. Okay, so that's our mask. So now we can see that whereas before our whole image looked terrible, now it's just the mountain that looks terrible. So what we're going to do is add a parametric mask to exclude the mountain from this mask. Okay. So now we need to go back to our parametric mask and choose a channel that's going to give us good separation between the sky and the mountain and the rest of the foreground. So I'm going to hover over the slider and press C. we go. And this is on the grey channel, the values, essentially the brightness of the different values of the image, and that's actually a pretty good selection already. The mountain's obviously much darker than the sky, so I think I'll just go with that one actually. So here we go. Now I'm going to put my visibility back on. I'm going to drag this slider up, and I'm going to follow it with its other one just so we can really remove the mountain from proceedings. And that's quite nice. Now you can see it's maybe a little bit harsh around the edges here, so I'm going to give it a little bit of feathering and also a little bit of blurring just to soften it off. And then if I turn my mask back off, we can see that whereas before the mountain was very dark, now it's completely unaffected by this adjustment we've made to the sky. So if I turn it off, on, so that just our sky is affected by that adjustment. Now we've got the masking, we can just maybe play around with the actual effect itself. It's maybe still a little bit bright here, so what we can do is change this fulcrum setting, drop that down a little bit. We can add even more drama, we can make it extremely dramatic if we want to, but then we begin to see some real nasty edges, and that's kind of not really matching the rest of the scene anyway. It's not a horror movie, so we're just going to drag that back up just until the effect's stronger but still subtle, and we'll maybe add a bit more feathering to the mask as well. Drop the mask opacity a little bit, there we go, that's better. So pretty good, I like that. Okay, now I want to add yet another form of contrast to my image in a way that's roughly analogous to the clarity and texture sliders in Lightroom. So to do that, I'm going to use what's called the contrast equalizer. So I'm going to type in contrast up here. Here's my contrast equalizer. Pop that on. Now by default, you'll probably see a circle of about this size. What we can do with this tool is drag different parts of the curve to affect different parts of the image. We can double click to reset the curve. And in order to get something that's roughly analogous to clarity, what we can do is roll the mouse wheel down. And we can see that the area we're affecting with our dragging gets bigger and bigger. I'm going to roll this wheel until it's way outside the bounds of the graph itself. And I'm just going to drag very slightly upwards. Clarity is one of those settings that, if you overdo it, can quickly completely overcook your image until it looks absolutely terrible. So just a little bit of less is more is always good when it comes to clarity. Just a touch, barely visible at all. And then we're going to use the same tool to add some texture. So before I do that, I'm going to control click, call this clarity. I'm going to right click my multiple instance actions button. I'm going to control click again and call this texture. And with this, we're going to use the default circle size here. And we're going to very slightly drag up the left hand end. I don't mind left from my right today. Drag up the left, just a touch. And drag up on the right, just a touch. So we can see the difference this is making, just very subtle. We can see maybe here in the grass is the strongest area. We can see that we're adding some micro texture and a little bit of kind of global texture as well. We can see it in the waterfall, we can see it in the grass. Just enough. Less is more is always the watchword I find in processing. If you can see what's been done, then you've probably done too much. Okay, I'm happy with it. Now that we've done the bulk of adjustments in terms of colour and exposure, what we can now look at is other details. So one thing I've noticed is this branches of this tree intruding on the left hand side of the frame here. Obviously I missed that when I was composing the shot. I could crop it out, but then we're getting the edge of the frame a little bit close to this rock and it may look a little bit tight. So what I'm going to do instead is to retouch it out of visibility. Because we're right on the edge of the frame here, that can cause some issues. So what I'm going to do first is enlarge the canvas. So I'm going to go over to my search box here, type in large canvas, put that on. I want to add some canvas to the left hand side of the frame. That will do, doesn't need to be much. I'm just going to make the colour black. I can reduce that down. And then that will allow me to have a bit of room on the edge of the frame. There we go. So now I can grab my retouch tool, turn that on as well. And you've got several options here. You can just do it as a simple kind of circle ellipse, same as the other masking options really, and different algorithms for how it's doing the retouching. So I'm going to choose path. It gives you the most kind of flexibility. And this is my kind of cloning area here, so I'm going to pick somewhere appropriate. I'm not too worried about what it's doing on this side of the canvas because that's going to be disappearing in a minute once I reduce that enlargement back down to nothing. So I'm mainly concerned with how it's going to appear on this side, and obviously we're starting to get some weirdness here. So I'm going to drag in these handles to limit the effects of what we're looking at. It's not bad. And with anything on the edge of the frame like this, you always have to take into account that you're staring at it because you know you're working on it, but general viewers of the photo won't be kind of inspecting your image with that much detail. So while it may look kind of really obvious to you where there's been some retouching done, at the end of the day it probably won't be noticeable, ideally, if you've done a good enough job, to the average viewer. So let me zoom back out, and I'm going to hide that control. I think that would probably be enough. Let me go back to my canvas enlargement and then take it back off. Still a little bit of brown, but I don't think it's particularly noticeable actually. I wouldn't notice that if I was looking around an image. There's so much on the edge of the frame. I think that's fine. Okay, so now it's time, I think, for just a few finishing touches. The first one I'm going to add is something I add to more or less all my images, which is a vignette. A great way just to add some depth, focus the viewer's attention on where you want it to be, and the vignetting tool is quite powerful in Darktable. The default is very round, which is slightly odd given that photographs are usually rectangular in aspect, and also as you can see in the sliders here, they also reduce the saturation somewhat, which again is a slightly odd choice. It's I'm not sure why you'd want to do that. So I'm going to increase saturation to 0 so that it doesn't affect the saturation at all, and I'm going to change the width and height ratio to bring it more into a rectangular aspect. And then we have two ovals here. So this is your where the start of the fall off of the effect begins, so where it starts to fade out, and then the fall off radius is this outer rectangle. So if you can see, I can bring it right in. You can see that there's no fall off whatsoever. It's just a very stark difference in exposure. So I'm going to obviously want to blur that out. As with everything, this effect should be very subtle. We can recenter the vignette here, so I'm going to put it roughly, focusing our attention on the waterfall and the mountain, which is kind of already there anyway, I'm sure, but it doesn't hurt to reinforce it. And just bring that in a little bit, and then we can adjust our brightness up or down. Again, we don't want it to be so noticeable. If you can see a noticeable vignette, then you've probably done it too much. There we go. Just enough, that's fine. Another thing we can add is a frame. Just adds a little bit of pictorial nature. Sorry, it's not frame, it's framing. So I'm going to go into my search bar, type framing. If I turn that on, the default frame again is a little much. I think it's a bit too big. I tend to leave everything exactly the same as the default and then bring it back down to about 5%. And incidentally, if you ever want to type in a value rather than kind of just sliding it in, you can right click the value and then you can type. So there we go, 5%, a nice white border. Just makes it a little bit more pictorial, makes it look more like a photograph as opposed to a digital image, I think. And finally, we want to sharpen the image. I do this last mainly because the diffusion sharpening module is quite hard on the processor. It does a lot of work, and so if you have it on throughout the entire image processing, it can tend to slow things down a little bit. And also things like your contrast adjustments will affect sharpening as well, so it's generally best to do it last thing. So to sharpen, I'm going to use the module that's called diffuse or sharpen. It does both, it blurs and it sharpens. And I'm going to use a preset, which is Lens Deblur Medium. That will work away, and then we've got our sharpen effect. So we can see it especially here in our fine details. Now, naturally, the sky is quite soft, it's just lots of grey cloud, so we don't necessarily want to sharpen there anyway. We're going to introduce noise if we sharpen that. So what we can do is we can mask that off. If you recall, we've already masked the sky when we added our kind of sky drama color calibration setting. So we have a mask pre-existing. So down here in our masking panel, I can click this last one, raster mask. The bottom option is raster mask, no mask used. I can click that and I can choose my color calibration sky drama, and that will mask the effect. Now if I click it here, that's going to show that in fact we're only applying the sharpening to the sky, which is the opposite of what we want. So we want to flip the mask, we want to reverse its polarity. We can do that by clicking this little minus button here, which will flip the mask, and now we're selecting everything but the sky. I'll just turn the mask display back off. So now we're just sharpening the foreground and we're leaving the sky alone. And we haven't had to do too much work to mask it off because we've already done it before. One final step, I think. Okay, so the final little step is a little bit of local contrast, and I'm going to use another instance of diffuse or sharpen for that. So I'm going to right click the button and I'm going to choose another preset, which is local contrast fast. And the way the tone mapper works, we actually want this to appear after the tone mapping in the pipeline. So if you hold Control and Shift and then drag that adjustment above our tone mapper, which in this case is sigmoid, for the best results. And there we go. That's our local contrast. Just gives a little bit more punch. You can see especially in the waterfall that's really helped. And in general, I think I'm happy with that final image. If we want to compare and contrast our final edit with our original, we can expand this column over here, and this has a history of all the edits we've done. And I can take a snapshot of this final version, and then I can roll back our history to the original. So essentially the demosaicing is the last step of the kind of the default processing. There's our default image, our original image, and I can click on the snapshot again, and we can see that we've now got this this bar down the middle of the image, and I can click and drag to show the original and the edit. So you can see we've got a slight bit of kind of displacement where the lens correction kicked in. Generally a much warmer, much more detailed, more dramatic image. Of course we don't have the frame as well in the final one, but I think that's just what Darkroom does to keep things lined up. So there we go. And then we'll go back to our final version. Okay, by clicking that last entry in the history stack. So there's our final image. I hope to be producing more Darktable landscape photography specific videos in the future. Do let me know what you think of this one down in the comments, and I'll see you again.